Sionagad, Kevin Stretz, Dodo, Scotsi Jaligigati. Today, we have with us Cherokee Ethnobiology Feather Smith. She has worked for the Cherokee Nation since 2007. She worked as a tour guide at the Diligwa village at the Cherokee Heritage Center until 2015. By the way, there are big plans that in the works on the rebuilding. She then served as cultural biologist before becoming the current ethnobiology manager with the Secretary of Natural Resources Office. As the ethnobiology manager, she oversees the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank, helps care for the Cherokee Nation Heirloom Garden and native plant site. Feather has a Bachelor's of Science in Fish and Wildlife Biology from Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, and she's also a former Miss Cherokee Ambassador, which we have that in common. Feather.
Sio Nagad. I'm excited to see a lot of familiar faces here. I got to see some of you and meet some of you yesterday. Of course, I'm Feather Smith. I work with our Secretary of Natural Resources Office. And our title here is Ethnobiology, which is the department I work in. Most people are pretty familiar with biology, which is the study of all living life. It's the study of how we interact with our environments. But when we're talking about ethnobiology, we're looking at how a people interacts with their environments. And of course, we're focused on how Cherokees interact with our environment. So this is sort of a Cherokee proverb, and it says that no self-respecting Cherokee would be without a corn patch. I believe this is actually attributed to Redbird Smith, and it's something that anytime that we are working out at the garden, we're working out at the site, we keep this in mind. We were an agricultural society, growing, harvesting, kind of influenced everything that we did in our lives. It influenced our ceremonies, it influenced the way that we lived, how we chose our villages. It kind of influenced everything. And so even today, this is really a big part of being who Cherokee is, being a Cherokee. We oftentimes say that you can't be Cherokee without Cherokee plants, and vice versa. We would have no Cherokee plants without the Cherokee. So this is actually an aerial photo of the Cherokee Nation Heirloom Garden at Native Plant Site. Many of you got to come down and visit yesterday. This sits just east of the Cherokee Nation complex, and it's where we grow probably about 80% of the seeds for the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank. Due to cross-pollination issues, we can't grow everything on that one site every year, so we do grow on a couple of different sites, but you can actually see that we have tried to lay a lot of our beds in culturally relevant shapes. We were really looking when we started laying the beds in those shapes to try to do things that we would have seen prior to European contact in our artwork, but we do also have some more modern symbols in there as well. And one thing that we always kind of remind people when you get to come out to the site is it was done almost entirely backwards of what we would have probably done had we realized what it was going to become. We kind of started growing out there by accident, and we started adding in native plants, and then eventually we added in an irrigation system, and then eventually that irrigation system had to be changed. And so we would have probably definitely laid the entire thing out completely differently had we realized what it was going to become, but we're really, really proud of the site and happy with what it has become. So we will have two parts to this presentation. We're going to go over the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank activities first, and then we'll talk a little bit about some cultural forestry. So of course, prior to European contact, we lived in the southeastern parts of the United States. There in the Carolinas, Virginias, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. Getting into removal, we actually, of course, moved into this northeastern part of Oklahoma. But what's really kind of nice to see on this map is that in the southeast, we sat right there in the center of the eastern deciduous forest. Now here in Indian Territory, we still sit on the fringes of the eastern deciduous forest. We're also on the fringes of the tall grass prairies, the cross timbers. So the environment here is a little bit different. It's also pretty similar to what we had in the Southeast. So for our purposes, luckily there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the plants that we were most reliant on in the Southeast, we still have here in Northeast Oklahoma, but we've had to learn to adapt. We've adapted to some new plants along the way, and it has also changed the way that we grow some of our heirloom crops, because the crops don't grow quite the same here in Northeast Oklahoma as they did back in the Carolina region. Go ahead and skip to the next slide. So we have a fairly wide species variety. Of course, most people are familiar with the Cherokees were known for growing the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but we actually have a far longer history with corn and beans. The corn and the beans, when you especially go back into our stories, our lore, we always talk about those because we had a far closer connection with corn and beans even than squash. But squash and pumpkins were also very important too. Then we grow things like gourds, native tobacco, and some native plants as well. So we have 4 varieties of corn that we pass out through the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank. What we have pictured here are the Cherokee colored flower, yellow flower, and white flowered corns. And when we talk about corn, we oftentimes talk about Selu, mother corn. It's really more important for us. Of the 3 sisters, corn was kind of the most important. You always hear about mother corn, but you don't ever really hear about mother beans, mother squash. And after growing for several years out at the site, I can tell you that most of the time we're referring to mother corn that way. She was more important because she's reliable. Whenever you're growing food, whenever you're growing crops for food, and this is what you're going to have to rely on throughout the winter time, the crop that is the most reliable is probably going to wind up being the most important one. And corn very rarely fails us. Almost every year it gives us a great harvest. It may not always be a perfect harvest. Things don't always quite come out the way that we want them to look. But in most cases, corn is going to give us a good harvest. Now, I say all of that because if you were on the tour yesterday, you got to learn that this year was not one of those years. We've had kind of a funny summer in that we've experienced really, really high heat and then really, really cool temperatures. And we've just kind of fluctuated back and forth as opposed to kind of gradually going into other temperatures. We also lucked out that corn was pollinating right at the point where we were out at the hottest point of the summer, which kind of hit earlier than it usually does. And corn pollination rates start dropping off at like, I think 98 degrees, and they drop off 10% for every degree after that. So we had really, really poor pollination rates on corn. And I just say all of that to please be easy on us next year when it comes time for the seed bank giveaway, because we don't have as much corn, but we've had some success with some of our other crops. So our Cherokee White Eagle corn is by far our oldest and our most unique variety of seed. We know that the Cherokee White Eagle, we have a lot of stories about how our seeds were carried across the Trail of Tears and brought here with us. But we know White Eagle was because we can't quite say for sure that all of the varieties were. And when it came time to finding seeds, we had to work a lot with a lot of different entities. We worked a lot with the Eastern Band of Cherokees to get those seeds back here into the Cherokee Nation. But White Eagle was one that was carried with us. The literature on here says that it gets about 8 to 10 feet tall. It generally loves Oklahoma heat and will oftentimes get 14, 15 feet tall here in Oklahoma. On a perfect cob, on a perfect stalk, every single cob is going to be a deep red color, and then the corn kernels themselves are going to kind of range from a white yellow into a purple blue. And on the perfect cob, go ahead and switch to the next slide. On a perfect cob, every purple kernel is going to have that white eagle flying on the side of it, which is why it has the name White Eagle. White Eagle is a dent corn, so for eating purposes, you can eat this, although that wasn't really always the use. This was kind of a ceremonial corn for us. The flour corns are the better to eat, but this one can be ground into meal. It's just not going to quite taste as well as things like those flour corns will. Now, we do grow 4 varieties of beans. This year, we're growing the Trail of Tears at the site. We also grow Cherokee Long Greasy, Black Turkey Gizzard beans, and Brown Turkey Gizzard beans. All of our beans are pole beans, so they're going to need something to climb up. And if you were growing in that Three Sisters method, they would actually climb up the corn. So we would plant our corn first, let it get about 6 inches to about a foot tall, and then we would plant the beans around the base of that corn, and as those bean vines start to grow, they're going to crawl up the stalk of that corn. As they crawl up that stalk, they add some structure to the corn so it's less likely to get blown over, and they also help to fix nitrogen in the soil because Beans are actually going to take nitrogen out of the air and fix those into the soil, and corn likes a lot of nitrogen. They grow well together for that reason, but they don't grow so well together here in Oklahoma. We like to, or the Eastern Band especially, always like to talk about the fact that Cherokee beans were rust-free. That's not always true here. If we plant Cherokee beans too early in the spring, we do have issues with rust. So if we'll wait a couple of weeks, let the temperatures warm up just a little bit more, where we usually have better germination rates anyway, we don't have to deal with the rust, but beans really don't like extreme high heat. All of our seeds are warm weather loving crops, so they all need 4-inch soil temperatures of 65 degrees. So if you were to dig down 4 inches, you want at least 65 degrees. Generally, we're going to hit that about 2 weeks after the last frost. But that's always kind of the trick, is when is really the last frost. You know, sometimes we get hit with those late frosts. So trying to time all of that is a little bit tricky. But we're going to plant beans first. Generally what happens here in Oklahoma is if we try to plant our corn too early, if we try to plant that now in late April or early May, the temperatures are going to be too cool, and we're oftentimes getting a lot of rain, and we don't get very good germination rates, or they don't survive. Our corn actually prefers to be planted a little bit later, like mid-May, late May. At that point, usually our beans are up and they're going. So we're planting them completely backwards of what we would have done if we were wanting those beans to be able to crawl up that corn. If we wait until our corn is at a good size to plant our beans, we get no pollination on our beans, because generally, if we can get these going early enough in the spring, they'll give us a small spring crop. And then we want to try to keep them alive throughout the summertime if we don't get a huge spring crop, and kind of aim for a fall crop. And again, we're usually harvesting corn sometime in July, August, somewhere in there, and we're not going to be keeping that up throughout the fall. But if we can keep our beans alive long enough, we often get some of our best crops in the fall. So they just don't grow real great in that method here in Oklahoma. That's not to say it's a myth though. Now, our Georgia Candy Roaster squash so far has been our most popular seed every single year. The Georgia Candy Roaster is a very large winter squash. They can get about 2 feet long. They can potentially weigh up to about 20 pounds, and they're kind of sweet. So any recipes calling for squash, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, you can use the Georgia Candy Roaster for. And so for that reason, every single year, it's one of my top requested seeds. Everybody loves the squash. It tastes really, really well. It's a little bit tricky to grow here in Oklahoma though, because again, it really doesn't like high temperatures. So once we start getting above 93 degrees, oftentimes the squash kind of starts getting stressed out. It'll start to wilt, and it just doesn't do quite as well. If you were out at the garden yesterday, it's a little bit sad looking right now, but these cooler temperatures are helping it to kind of rebound. So hopefully we'll get a good fall crop, and we should have some seeds from the Georgia Candy Roaster and the seed bank this next year. Of course, that's also going to depend, because things like our Georgia Candy Roaster squash don't give as many seeds per fruit as things like the Cherokee Tan Pumpkin do. Our Cherokee Tan Pumpkin is the most recent heirloom crop addition into the seed bank. We just started growing the Cherokee Tan Pumpkins, I think, in 2021. And so far, and I should always say that and knock on wood, we've had a lot of success with growing the pumpkins. They tend to handle the heat much easier. One pumpkin gives far more seeds, which is kind of funny because they're a lot smaller than the squash is. Our pumpkins tend to kind of range from about 6 inches up to about 8 inches in diameter, so they're pretty small pumpkins. A lot of times they're even sweeter than the Georgia Candy Roaster squash. And I think for most people, they're kind of unfamiliar with cooking with and working with pumpkins so much. So there's been kind of some uncertainty for people who are more comfortable with the squash. They're not as comfortable with the pumpkins, but they can be cooked in the same ways. So a lot of the same recipes that we would use for the winter squash, we can use the Cherokee Tan Pumpkin for. In some cases, it's a little bit sweeter, so it might make your savory dishes a little bit sweeter. Now, we do grow gourds as well. All of the gourds that we're growing are utilitarian, and gourds are kind of funny in that they're technically native to the Old World. They're native to the Mediterranean region, but they predate all European contact in North America. They've been found in North America for at least a millennia. We do grow the basket gourds, dipper gourds, and jewelry gourds. So basket gourds are what's pictured up here. They're kind of the round gourds. Dipper gourds have the long handle growth, so they're great for water dippers. Jewelry gourds are the tiny ones. They're just probably about 3 inches in total size, tended to be used for jewelry, for things like medicine pouches. They make great ornaments now. And then we do provide buffalo gourds through the seed bank as well. They're the one seed that we have that is native to this part of the country. You wouldn't have found them in the southeast. They tend to kind of spread from Arkansas, Oklahoma on west, and they're about the size of a tennis ball. We grow native tobacco. Native tobacco is about 9 to 10 times stronger in nicotine content than that of smoking tobacco. So for most smokers, this stuff is too strong to use recreationally. And because tobacco is a sacred plant for us, it's a ceremonial plant, it would kind of be considered taboo to use it, to smoke it recreationally. This is really meant for medicine. But tobacco is also a great attractor of pollinators. So we do distribute seeds through the seed bank, and oftentimes people are curious if there's any benefits to growing these in their gardens, and there is, because they do attract the pollinators. Bees, butterflies, they love them. If you're growing things like tomatoes, tomato hornworms are actually tobacco hornworms. So the tomato hornworms will be attracted to your tobacco, which is the host plant. They won't normally kill it because it's the host plant, and in most cases they'll leave your tomatoes alone. They kind of have their own natural pesticide traits. Of course, they do attract their own pest, like with the hornworms. And hummingbirds love them. So if you've been out to the garden, I always talk about this, it's one of my favorite things, but if you'd like to have hummingbirds and you want to do a hummingbird garden, hummingbirds love tobacco. And a lot of old Cherokee myths and stories, we talk about the hummingbirds carrying tobacco seeds in his wings. Every single year we have hummingbirds out at the site. We grow trumpet vine, we grow jewelweed, we have all kinds of flowers out there that attract hummingbirds. They don't bother with us until the tobacco is flowering. They do not show up until there's nicotine out there for them. But once we have tobacco, they show up at the site and they are frequent visitors there at the tobacco bed. So we do grow a variety of heirloom or native plants as well. We started the heirloom garden site in, I think, 2006, I believe, was the first year that we grew out there. And if you haven't been out there, there's a natural little kind of spring-fed area that sort of bubbles up and runs through that site. And so our elders wanted to see us start incorporating native plants out there. And over the years, a lot of our native plants have been pretty good to us. We've had some success. And so if they will provide seeds to us, we give the seeds that we can easily get off of those plants through the seed bank as well. One of our favorite plants is the sunchoke, or the Jerusalem artichoke. This is technically a sunflower, and the plant itself can get to be about 8 to 10 feet tall. So it's a big sunflower. The flower itself is pretty small, though. You can see a picture of it up here in the corner. It's just a small yellow sunflower. But what's really special about the sunchoke is that it produces a tuber that can be eaten just like a potato. So one plant can produce potentially up to 5 gallons of tubers, and the tubers can be eaten raw. The more raw they are, they kind of have the taste and the texture of something like a water chestnut. But once they're cooked, the more and more cooked they are, the more their taste and texture is similar to that of a potato. Anybody who's had sunchokes and has gotten to saute them, fry them, roast them, has all found that they really enjoy them. So if you like potatoes, you will probably enjoy sunchokes. The one word of warning I will give is sunchokes do store their starch as inulin, and for diabetic purposes, they're much healthier because they're not going to mess with blood glucose levels like potatoes will. But if you're not used to eating a lot of fiber, you're not used to eating inulin, it gets the system going. A lot of the Europeans and the settlers who stayed with Cherokees and villages, back in the 1700s, they have interesting diary excerpts talking about the nights filled with flatulence after getting to try the sunchokes and how much they enjoyed the sunchokes. But again, it gets the system going. So one of the things that really got our Cherokee Nation Seed Bank going was a conversation about the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. We had a Cherokee citizen who wanted to see the Cherokee Nation represented at the Global Seed Vault, which is located in Norway. If you're not familiar with it, it's supposed to be sort of like a doomsday vault. So the idea is that if in the case of any sort of natural disasters or man-made disasters, that vault and the seeds that are inside that vault are going to survive. And they accept seeds from countries around the world. They can put their seeds into that vault, and then if something happens, they can come back and pull their seeds out. Being that we're a sovereign nation, our citizen wanted to see us represented. At the time, the only seed that they could think about was the Cherokee purple tomato, which is another very highly requested seed through the seed bank. But it is not a Cherokee seed. It's Cherokee like your Jeep Grand Cherokee is. It's got the name. Cherokee purple tomatoes are great, but they were not cultivated by the tribe. And so that did lead to the conversation, though, of, okay, well, why don't we send the seeds that we do have? Because obviously we're an agricultural tribe and we've always had seeds. And we couldn't find any seeds. So that really became the mission of the group at that time. And I keep saying at that time, I was not with them. Of course, I started in 2014. This all would have happened in the early 2000s. So at the time, they start kind of doing the research and they get to find that they can't find any seeds. And so that really became the mission, was to find our Cherokee heirloom crops and bring them back here into the Cherokee Nation. Once we did that, it took some time, and eventually we were able to find our 9, now 10 varieties of heirloom crops. And we really became more focused once we got those seeds on genetic preservation, because the seeds weren't in great shape genetically. And so that became our mission, and that became our focus, was that we were going to get a hold of these heirloom crops and grow them for preservation. And the seed bank giveaway was sort of an accidental product of that, because we got to realizing we had all of this excess, and that could be shared with our citizens, and that we really only needed a small amount for our genetic stock. Then we completely forgot about Svalbard. But back in 2019, Pat had done an article with NPR, and in that he talked about that origin story and kind of talked about, the Svalbard, kind of getting the Svalbard conversation, getting the ball rolling. And so then Svalbard reached out to us and actually said that they would love to have the Cherokee Nation represented, and wondered if we were still interested in having our heirloom crops stored at the Global Seed Vault in Norway. And so it took some conversations. Everybody sort of sat down and went, is this still something that we're interested in? Is this something that we can do? And then, of course, we had to figure out what the requirements were. And one of the requirements was that Svalbard needed us to send such a large amount of seeds that it was going to potentially mean that we would not have a seed bank giveaway for a year to maybe even 2 years, at least not on Cherokee heirloom crops. And we weren't really sure why they needed quite that amount of seeds. So again, Pat and Sarah Hill was actually our Secretary of Natural Resources at that time. They sat down and they talked with Svalbard about that. And Svalbard does some genetic research, some genetic testing and things on the seeds that come into their vault. And for us, our seeds are sacred. They're a part of who we are. They're Cherokee, just like we're Cherokee. So that's not really something that we could allow to do. We couldn't really allow any non-Cherokee to do any sort of testing or modification or work on these seeds, even for that purpose. And so we kind of had to regretfully decline at first. And they came back and they asked why, and we kind of explained the culture, the history behind these seeds to them. And so then they came back to us and they said, what if we just store the seeds in the vault? You can send your seeds over here for this purpose. We would only need, this amount of seeds, and you will send them over to us sealed. You guys will seal them on your own. We will store them in the vault. We will never open them, and eventually when the time comes, we will send them back to you still sealed. And so we sat down again, we talked about it, and we agreed at that point that was something that we were willing to do, because we currently had our seeds, or at the time we had our seeds stored in 2 areas. We had our main genetic stock, we had a backup genetic stock, but both of those were actually right here within the heart of the Cherokee Nation. And so there was kind of that question on, if anything disastrous were to ever happen and we lost both of these stocks, our seeds were potentially at risk of being lost. Having them at Norway ensured that we had them split between 3 different places, and we were able to ensure that those seeds were always going to be there. So this is Chief Hoskin, and this is Attorney General Chad Harshaw. Chad was the Secretary of Natural Resources at the time, and they're holding the 9 varieties of seeds that were sent over to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Our next slide here shows a picture of the vault. So that's the outside, and in the next picture, he's actually holding the container that's the vault that they're going to be put into as he's getting ready to shelve those seeds. And that was kind of our next concession before we sent our seeds over, because of course, Svalbard is a scientific endeavor, so they have very specific ways of labeling and doing things, but our seeds are Cherokee first, and that means that their true names are Cherokee names, and their true names we would represent in syllabary. And so that was something that they had never really ran into before, but they listed all of our labeling in Cherokee syllabary first, and then used the regular vernacular. So just kind of one of those really nice things that we got to add whenever we sent these over to Svalbard. We were the first Native American tribe to be represented at the vault. So every year we do a Cherokee Nation Seed Bank giveaway. I'm sure many of you have received seeds before, but if you have not, we generally will open up the seed bank sometime in February. So February 1st or later in February, we're going to start accepting seed requests through the seed bank. If you've received seeds in the past, you know that at one time we used to take seed requests by phone, by email, kind of all those processes. I think in 2016, 17, we moved to an online website. It kind of streamlined the process. It also made us more popular. And then a couple of years ago, we moved on to the Dagadugi portal, and we have had record-breaking years and how quickly we have ran out of seeds ever since. Last year in 2023, we had ran out of all of our seed stock in about, I think, 3 or 4 days, and that was a record for us. This year, we beat that record in 3 hours and 20 minutes. The seed bank is incredibly popular, which is, of course, something that we're pretty proud of. We're happy for the success, but we also understand that it makes it very hard for citizens who are also really interested in getting seeds to get seeds. So we will probably be changing the process just a little bit going into 2025. I think we're actually looking at a draw-out system, which is going to be pretty similar to how we do our draw out for hunts. We will have an inventory-based system again, so we will pre-count all of our seeds. We will get those up onto the website. Everybody will be able to request the seeds that we want, but then it's probably going to be a matter of then taking that particular seed variety and drawing the names from everybody who requested for that. So we will see how that goes, and please be patient with us as we go into this new process. So we say that you will get snake bit in gardening, and we don't literally mean snake bit, but things happen. Sometimes we have bad luck in gardening, so it never fails. When you're gardening, things are going to happen. We're going to have high heat years. We're going to have early frost, late frost. So going into this next slide, you will see that this is our squash. This is a great example of talking about this because this is a good, healthy squash. This is what we want our squash plants to look like. At the bottom there, it says Osta, it says good. This is a good plant. But the first year that we grew squash out at the site, absolute bumper crop of a year. We were just loaded in Georgia candy roaster squash. It's never quite worked the same since then because that next year we started having problems where the squash plants just started dying and actually were dying in a matter of hours. Now, it was late enough in the season that we were getting fruit on the plants. So you can see there's squash laying there on the ground, and it's actually good squash. It's far enough along that it would be good to eat, but the vines themselves are dead, and you can't see any leaves on those because the leaves have just turned to slime and they're laying on the ground. And it took a while. We really weren't sure what the issue was. They kind of thought maybe it was a vandalism issue, maybe it was a pest. They sat out there one whole day or a couple of days just watching the plants go from healthy that morning to dead that afternoon. And after doing some research, we figured out that it was bacterial wilt caused by the cucumber beetle. And technically, it's not the cucumber beetle that causes it. It's a bacteria that he carries in his stomach, and whenever they feed on squash plants, they transfer that bacteria into the plant, and it causes wilt. On our more modern varieties of squash, it's really not that big a deal. It might make them a little bit unpretty. It doesn't usually kill them, but on our heirloom variety of squash, it was just killing it in a matter of hours. And what we've kind of figured out since then is it's still not the wilt on its own that's the hardest on the squash, it's the wilt combined with the heat. So when we combine that bacterial wilt with 93+ degree temperatures, it's going to kill the plants. And that's why our plants look so unsightly now. Over the years, this is when we started using pesticides at the site. We use a mixture of either 7 dust or 8 dust mixed with diatomaceous earth. And over the years, we've been able to, lower the numbers of bugs that are on the plants. They're still getting introduced to the wilt, but not just overloaded by it. And so the squash is kind of building up some resistance to that wilt. But the other thing that we have to do, which makes all gardeners cringe, is that we will oftentimes water at the site, water over the squash for about 10 to 15 minutes in the afternoon when we're getting above 93 degrees. And you can actually watch the squash. You can go out that morning. It looks nice and pretty. By noon, it's starting to wilt. By 1, 2 o'clock, it's sad looking. And if we'll flip that water on just to cool it off for about 10 minutes, you can kind of watch them bounce back up. They'll sort of slowly fade back out once the water goes off, and then when nighttime comes around, they'll bounce back up, and we just kind of continue that process. And again, all of that is kind of helping our squash over time to gain a little bit of resistance to the heat, gain a little bit of resistance to the wilt, but they really just don't like those high temperatures, which fortunately our pumpkins haven't given us those issues yet. So this just kind of talks about the wilt. There's the scientific name of the bacteria. Next slide. So now we're going to go ahead and switch gears and talk about a little bit of cultural forestry. And this is the other part of our ethnobiology department. The biggest portion of what I do is the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank and the Cherokee Nation Heirloom Garden. And in the ethnobiology department, we only have 2 full-time workers, me and then our ethnobiology tech, Chase Gifford. He is our 1 full-time worker that's out there at the site all the time. So if you get to go by the garden at any normal day, usually it's Chase that's out there working. But we are it. We are the only full-time workers in the department. So we kind of luck out that a lot of the natural resources department is willing to help us if we need an extra hand, if we need to call on somebody and need some extra muscle out there especially. And this year we've had a day worker, Jessica Velasquez, who has been great with getting a lot of the little detailed work and a lot of the weeding done. We've had some interns in the past who have helped us out a lot. So we're a fairly small department for the amount of seeds and for the amount of gardening that we're having to do each year. But cultural forestry is sort of our next part, and that goes into the native plants of our garden. It says these ain't no trees because, of course, Cherokees are considered a people of the eastern deciduous forest, but the forest, the trees themselves, are only really kind of a small component of that forest. They set up the environment for all of those other plants, for all of the wildlife that are in those forests that oftentimes for us were even more important. And so we point this out because for a long time, a lot of people thought that pine planting was really the way to replace forest. And we have had a lot of issues, kind of especially working with the governments historically, where they would go through and they would clear cut eastern deciduous forest, and they would replace those eastern deciduous forests with pine trees. And timber is good for, of course, economy. It's going to be good for selling, but pine forest completely changed the environment. They changed the pH of the soil. They changed the way that the light filters through. Those pine needles just completely take over the soil. So all of those plants that we find in that eastern deciduous forest setting, we're not going to find in a thick pine forest setting. And that's kind of something that we're commonly trying to kind of educate on, because for us, for our purposes, we really need that eastern deciduous forest. So next slide. I'm going to test you guys a little bit. We'll try to go through this a little bit quickly. What is this? Eastern red cedar. Of course, cedar we use because it's cleansing. This is what we're going to use whenever we're blessing and kind of trying to get the negative out of an area. We've seen this one. Jola, tobacco. Of course, native tobacco is ceremonial. Anybody know this one? What's that? Ginseng. This is American ginseng. So this is not one that we would see as common here in Oklahoma. We kind of have the settings for it. We know that if we manage it and care for it, we can make it grow here. But naturally, the only time I've seen it kind of growing on its own is just a couple hours over into Arkansas, kind of in the dead of the Ozarks. But ginseng was a very important plant for us. Think about things like energy drinks. A lot of your energy drinks kind of list some of the ingredients along the top of them, and they commonly say ginseng. Now, those are referring to the Asian version, but we kind of use ginseng in a similar manner. Close, not quite, kind of. This one is golden seal, although all good guesses, and we'll see those later on. This one's golden seal, and golden seal has antifungal properties. So ginseng likes to get fungus on its roots. Golden seal will protect the ginseng roots from fungus. And again, we use it medicinally in kind of a similar manner. But oftentimes when you're looking for ginseng, a lot of ginseng hunters will look for golden seal first because you're more likely to spot this first, and they always kind of grow together because of that symbiotic relationship. This is sort of a tough picture to see. Can anybody identify this one? It kind of looks like cane. It's not cane. It like I said, it's kind of a tough picture. So this is prairie willow, also referred to as red root. And we call it red root because it has bright red roots. We use this a lot, teas from this in ceremonies. It grows as both a male and a female, and they too do tend to be used differently medicinally. Anybody know this one? So this particular plant is a great example of why common names aren't always the best way to identify a plant, because this one's also referred to as red root. It also has a really bright red root. Prairie willow and New Jersey tea are not, they are not related. They are completely, totally separate plants, but they both have really bright red roots, so a lot of people commonly refer to them that way. New Jersey tea gets its other common name because when the Boston Tea Party occurred and all the tea was dumped into the harbor, the settlers looking for alternative teas to drink started looking at what native people were drinking, and this is one thing that really took off. It's got good flavor, doesn't really have like caffeine or anything in it, but it's got some different medicinal properties. I think it was like used for headaches and upset stomachs and all those sorts of things. Rattlesnake master. Yeah, we've really got the rain coming down on us now. And, you know, the forecast kept saying it wasn't going to rain, but I've been watching it all week long. I've been telling everybody it was going to rain today. Yes, this is rattlesnake master. Rattlesnake master, we believe that snakes don't like it. They will stay away from it. We were also supposed to carry this regularly because it was kind of believed that it would protect you, it would keep others from sort of harassing you, things like, you know, snakes keeps those things from happening. And it was used to treat snake bites. There's actually a button on the root that was used to treat snake bites. So those are the 7 sacred plants of the Cherokee. Of course, 7 is a sacred number for us, and so we have things like 7 clans. These were our 7 sacred plants, and kind of even like with the language, sometimes different communities, different families don't always agree. Things kind of varied, I think, a little bit, especially coming here to Oklahoma because, like I said, ginseng isn't as common here. So some of those other plants are sometimes, other families would say other plants were the 7 sacred, but we work a lot with our medicine keepers, and so these were the ones that they probably agreed were the 7. Next slide. Anybody know this one? This is Sweet Everlasting. Yes, Sweet Everlasting is in the Asteraceae family, so it's in the sunflower family. It doesn't get the traditional looking sunflower on it. It's kind of high in menthol, and that's how we would use it. Teas were often made for this to help with congestion, to help clear out sinuses. That's bloodroot, yes. Bloodroot does have some medicinal properties, but bloodroot is its most common claim to fame as a basket dye. Cherokees, we are known for, traditionally would have been weaving our baskets out of river cane. And river cane is notoriously hard to work with. It's hard to harvest, it's hard to split, and it's hard to dye. Bloodroot, along with a couple others, are one of the few things that will dye river cane and don't fade out over time. So this is a really great dye to use. Watercress. Now, watercress, a lot of people don't actually realize this, is not native to North America. It was naturalized here, and nobody's quite sure when. There are some stories that say it was Lewis and Clark, and as they were traveling up and down the river, that they were actually spreading watercress. There is some evidence to suggest that it even predates Lewis and Clark, and some think it might have even been the Vikings who brought it over. But at any rate, it has now been naturalized across North America. It's very nutritious. It's one of those plants. It can actually be eaten really at any time of the year if you can find it, but it's best in the spring and in the fall because that's when the flavor is at its best. In the summertime, it tends to get really, really spicy and it gets a little bit tougher. This is a really tough photo to see. So this one is actually high bush huckleberry, but it's small, so it's a tough one to see in that photo. Kind of fun fact, technically what we could call a huckleberry here in Oklahoma is in the vaccinium family, and vacciniums are technically blueberries. True huckleberries are further north and west. However, this is what we could call a high bush huckleberry, and these can be very difficult to harvest. A lot of people talk about going out, especially as children, with their grandparents and harvesting huckleberries and having their little metal pail and hearing the plunk when you threw the first berry in there. And an hour later, you were still hearing the plunk as it hit the bottom of the barrel. So when you go to buy high bush huckleberries, they come with a pretty price tag too. Wild onions. Of course, wild onions and eggs are a delicacy. A lot of those spring greens, a lot of those fresh greens that come up first in the springtime were kind of seen as blood purifiers. After going all winter long and not having fresh foods, fresh green foods to eat, we kind of saw those green foods as they got everything going again. Echinacea, purple cone flower. This, of course, is an immune system booster. Anybody know this one? It can be, yes, green dragon. Sometimes it's referred to as Jack in the Pulpit. At one time, green dragon and Jack in the Pulpit were considered the same plant, and now they're considered separate species. So a lot of times those names can be interchangeable. So kind of a fun story with this one. When I worked at the Cherokee Heritage Center as a tour guide, of course, we worked with a lot of different people, and everybody knew I was in school for biology, and one of the things that they commonly did was go out and gather river cane. So one morning, our guys all go out and they're gathering cane, and when they come back that afternoon, one of the guys has this fruit, this kind of red cone-looking fruit with him. And he tosses it on the table and says, "Feather, what is this?" And I looked at him and said, "I have no idea. I was not a plant person before this job, so." So I'm looking at it going, "I have no idea. I've never seen this one before." And he said, "You know, this smells pretty good. It's kind of got a spicy, peppery scent. I'm pretty sure this is something that our ancestors ate. I'm going to try it." And I said, "No." We do not eat things that we don't know what they are. And it's bright red, and that's usually a warning to stay away. And so literally, him and I go back and forth for a while, and I think I eventually talk him out of eating the plant. We go on about our day. Of course, working out at the village, we're not supposed to have like our cell phones and things because we're in a 1700s recreational village. But he comes up to me a couple hours later and says, "Feather, we really need to learn what that plant was because I went ahead and tried it." And he's not feeling so great. And so we pull out our cell phones. Everybody gets to Googling, starts doing the Google image search, and I finally find that it is green dragon. And yes, it is toxic. Fortunately, it's not one of two plants in Oklahoma that small amounts can kill you. And kind of, I talk about Pat Gwynn a lot. Pat was really instrumental in getting the garden, the seed bank, and this department started. Pat retired on us last year. I have an enormous amount of respect for Pat and worked with him for a long time. He was definitely my mentor. Pat had a tendency of eating toxic plants on purpose. And so a lot of times when we would go out into the field, he would try things, and to make a point, he would go, blah, see, this just shows you could never eat enough of this to hurt you. Well, Pat has also tried this plant, and along with the guy who I was working with that summer who had tried it, and both of them swear, this one tastes great. This is one of those plants that actually tastes really, really good, and that you could easily eat enough of it to hurt you. In both cases, they said it was like having razor blades or needles stabbed into their tongue and down their throat over and over. And then you spend the rest of the day near a restroom, in the restroom, because it purges the system. It was a very painful experience. They both lived through it. But this is a plant that has medicinal purposes. With that said, this was a plant that we would have let our medicine man prepare and take care of. And it's also a great example on why you need to really know what plants you are dealing with before you go trying those plants. Anybody know this one? And I will say, this is just a little bit of a trick question. What's that? It's not thistle. I thought I might have heard it in the back. American basket flower, yes. You can see it's called basket flower because it kind of has a basket look to the bottom of it. It looks very similar to a thistle. Thistle is not native to North America. That is something that, of course, that has been introduced. It's very weedy. Most farmers hate it. Cherokees love it. Why do Cherokees love it? We use it for fletching for our darts for blowguns. But we didn't always have thistle. Before thistle, we had American basket flower. American basket flower isn't quite as easy to find. It doesn't grow in quite as many places. The fletching also isn't always quite as thick, so really thistles kind of make an easier dart than basket flower does. But basket flower is what we traditionally would have used, and this is something that we give through the Cherokee Seed Bank. So what is that? That's thistle. That's our bull thistle, our Scotch thistle there that we more commonly use now for our darts. Who all is allergic to poison ivy? Quite a few of you. Which of these is poison ivy? Yes, the left. So the one on the bottom, leaves of 3, let it be. And as you can see, looking at that left picture, 1, 2, 3 leaves. So what is the photo at the top? Virginia creeper. So a lot of times, it's very, very common for people to get these two mixed up. Poison ivy has urushiol oil in it. Poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac all have urushiol. It's a little bit different in each plant, but they all have the urushiol oil in them, and that's what caused the allergic outbreak. But poison ivy, as you see, we call it ulluti in Cherokee, and we also call Virginia creeper ulluti. And that actually refers to the fact that it climbs on or it grows on, and it's the fact that it's a vine. And these two plants do commonly grow in the same place together. Virginia creeper will usually leaf out first in the spring, and it oftentimes keeps its leaves a little bit longer in the fall. And at any time of the year, if you come into contact with a poison ivy vine, you can come into contact with that urushiol oil and have an outbreak. So it's very common for people to see Virginia creeper, but be touching poison ivy and not realize it, and they start to kind of get them confused, and they think that Virginia creeper is the bad plant. For 90% of the population, Virginia creeper is completely harmless, and it's poison ivy that we really want to watch out for. So the plant in the middle is called ulluti nuot. Anybody know what that one is? Jewelweed. And jewelweed has a chemical in it that will bind to the urushiol oil and poison ivy, and it will make it inactive. So if you know you've come into contact with poison ivy, you can go find a jewelweed plant, crush those up, kind of rub that all over, and as long as you completely rub it everywhere that urushiol oil is, you shouldn't break out. Actually, kind of fun, people aren't even realizing that this is going on right now, but this last week, working out in the garden, making sure it looked nice and pretty for Cherokee Holiday, we had a poison ivy plant growing up right next to one of our yellow root golden seal plants. And I didn't realize that I'm down there pulling things and see it at the last second. And so I did go over and kind of quickly grab a little bit of jewelweed because I don't want to pull too much right now. We want the seeds off the jewelweed, so I don't want to be too hard on the plants. But I grabbed a little bit, rubbed it over my hand, and got most of probably the oil off. I really wasn't too worried about it. I've got one little spot right here where it came up on my wrist, and I can almost guarantee that's just from where I didn't quite get that jewelweed right over there because I did it too quickly. So I literally have one little spot, but the fact that I don't have it all over my hands is a testament to how well that jewelweed does work. Everybody know this one? Sassafras. So of course with sassafras, again, we talk about leaves of three for a different reason. Most trees, their leaves are going to be pretty uniform. They all kind of look alike. But with sassafras trees, it's going to have three distinct leaves. It will have the sock, or that kind of single leaf there with no lobes. It will have the mitten, which is in the middle of this picture, but it's hard to see, but it's just going to have that single lobe. Or it will have that double-lobed leaf, which can be referred to as a glove, a turkey track, or a ghost. If you see those three distinct leaves, it's probably a sassafras tree, but if you really want to confirm, take a leaf, crush it up a little bit, and it'll kind of smell a little bit like root beer or sarsaparilla, or in some cases, I kind of find that it smells similar to Fruit Loops. Very, very tasty. Of course, sassafras tea is still pretty common. Saffron oil in large amounts is known to be a carcinogen. So it's generally recommended that for that reason, and also because it's a blood thinner, that you don't drink too much sassafras tea, but still a common thing for a lot of people to enjoy. Chinkapin. This is a picture of Ozark chinkapins. When I first started in this job, I used to have elders who would call me all the time, and they would ask me, what has happened to all the chinkapins? I can remember going out and gathering chinkapins when I was little, and we don't ever see them anymore. And at one point, the eastern deciduous forest was made up 40% of the American chestnut tree. But the chestnut blight was brought over in the 1940s to 60s, was kind of brought over on container ships and things, and it came over from Asia. And the blight, which is pretty harmless to their trees, doesn't cause too much trouble, was detrimental to our trees, and it has killed off almost all of the American chestnut trees. Well, here in Oklahoma, we didn't have chestnuts. We sit on the fringes, and what we would have actually had here is chinkapins. But chinkapin is so closely related to chestnuts that they're also heavily affected by the blight. And so most of our chinkapin trees have been lost for that same reason. There are a lot of groups who are working at creating more blight-resistant trees. The Ozark Chinkapin Society has been doing a lot of work on that for years, and so if you're ever curious about it, they're a great organization to look up. But the nut itself is very, very tasty. It's very nutritious. Wildlife love it. It's a great form of carbs and good fats. Not quite as much protein as some of the other nuts, but a lot of good carbs and fats in that. It's just, they're very hard to find now. Common mullein. Now, mullein is another one that's technically not native to North America. It has been naturalized here, but it's another one of those plants that we have just adopted because it has so many good uses. We use it as an arthritis medicine. We use it for teething babies. Sometimes it's kind of used similar to tobacco. The smoke can be used for like lung issues. So there's all kinds of uses for common mullein, and really one of those plants is that we adopted. Wishy, switching ideas from plants into our fungus a little bit, mushrooms. This is wishy, or I think in non-Cherokee communities, they usually call this hen of the woods. It took me a really long time to realize that not the entire world called this wishy. This is also referred to as hen of the woods. Very, very tasty. Usually people who don't like mushrooms will like wishy because it kind of has a little bit more of a meaty texture. Common morels. Of course, morels we generally will find at the bases of like sycamore trees. There's a few others, but sycamores is kind of a favorite to look for. Lion's mane, also referred to as old man's beard, or we call it owl's head. This is uguku, which is one of our words for owl, because we usually refer to it as owl's head. A little bit different, if you've never had it, the texture's a little bit different, kind of stringy like it looks and really not too strong a flavor. It's not a bad one. So all examples of, again, of non-wood or mostly non-wood forest products. We were a people of the eastern deciduous forest, but just like growing with our garden, we have a lot of problems with our native plants as well. You know, there's always going to be something in gardening. So again, you will get snake bit. We, of course, grow prairie willow or red root, which I talked about earlier, out at the site. And of course, many of you got to see the prairie willow yesterday. Years ago, when I first started, we had just gotten our first plant put out there, and our elders had been telling us that we needed to have prairie willow out there for a while. And so Pat was super proud of this plant, and he presents it to them and says, "Here, we've got this plant." And they said, "Great, but you need to have both." And he's like, "What do you mean both?" And they say, "Well, you know, it grows as a male and a female, and you need to have both represented." And he says, "Okay, what do we have?" And nobody knew. And he said, "Well, how do I tell the difference?" And nobody was really sure. And so when I first started the job, I think I said earlier 2014, it's 2015, that was kind of one of the big research projects that we were all working on, is everybody kind of sat down and we were researching how to tell the difference between a male and a female, looking for the phenotypical differences. And what we find out is that the only time you can tell the difference is when they flower, which is just for a couple of weeks in the spring. Males bloom with that sort of red, fluffy-looking flower. Females will bloom with more of a green, spiky-looking flower. And going off that information, we were finding all of this information right at the right time. We were pretty sure our plant was a male. So we go out and we start looking for this plant. Now, prairie willow is important for all of our southeastern woodlands tribes. It is a very highly utilized plant and very over-harvested plant, to the point that it grows pretty easily and will grow along roadsides and things. It's sort of an edge species. It does really well when managed, and yet it has almost been harvested out of existence in most counties in Oklahoma. It only grows naturally now in, I think, 3 counties. So we go to a couple different sites, and all of the sites we're finding are either all males or they only have 1 female, and we can't pull the 1 female from a site. So eventually they go out to a site. I wasn't with them that day. And they pick a plant, and they bring the plant back, and Pat says, "Feather, what is this?" And I looked at him and I said, "I have no idea." And he goes, "We're going to send you guys back out next week and bring back 1 more plant." He said, "We found a site," and he said, "It's loaded with plants." And he said, "There's males, but there's everything in between." And so he sends us back out the next week. We talk quite a bit and eventually find a plant that we're like 80% sure is probably a female. We're kind of getting closer to the end of the blooming stage. And so we just had to bring it back, transplant it into the garden, and wait till the next year. Come that following year, our first one, our male, bloomed as a male. Our second one that we brought back that we were 80% sure on bloomed as a female. The one that we brought back in between, still we were not sure. Every year it has characteristics kind of both. Over the years it's kind of looking more male than anything, but all we knew was that between the 3 we had our bases covered. So our male and our female were planted right next to each other, and the other one was planted a little bit up the stream. But we have all 3. Our next slide will actually show, so this is a very over-harvested plant, and it's a very highly in demand plant. And so one of the things that we do, because it does really, really well when managed, is every single year we have to go out to the site, and of course we prune back our trees, we prune back our shrubs, and our prairie willow does so great that it's one that has to be pruned. Every year when we take clippings off of that, instead of putting them into the mulch pile or into the burn pile, we take those clippings, stick them down in some rooting compound, and we start new plants. And we have, the first time that we did this, we had like 90% success rate. Over the years, that can vary. I think this last time, or a couple years ago, we had like a 40% success rate. Our males take this process much easier than the females do. Females really don't like trying to be kind of cloned and restarted. And so we've had some success with this over the years, but we've got some plants coming up, and when we have elders or communities that really need them, we're able to get those plants to them. So this is our Cherokee Nation medicine keepers. This is probably one of my favorite parts of the job, is when we get to help out with them. They are a group of Cherokee elders who have a strong plant knowledge, who are first language speakers, and they came together to kind of help preserve that plant knowledge. And in this next slide, you see this is Crosland Smith, and he was for a long time their spiritual leader. He just unfortunately passed this last year. But Crosland oftentimes talked about the fact that our capacity to do good was for all people, no matter their color. And so keeping up with that thinking, that's really what they're trying to do. And so they've been working for a long time, because the idea was to always help spread, kind of share this information with the next generation. So in this next slide, you'll see that they actually had a group of students who have now graduated out, but they got to go through a program where they were partnered up with a medicine keeper and were learning language, doing community projects, and learning Cherokee medicines. And some of these students had never done things like even getting to go out and gather wild onions. So you'll see in that next slide, we had actually taken them out and had done wild onion digs, and then they were able to bring that back and give those to our elders and cook a meal for them. We've done sunchoke harvest. They've been able to prepare medicines. So it's been a really, really great project to get to work with, and anytime if the medicine keepers need us, we try to be available for them. All right. Well, Dawn, thank you all for having me today.
We have time for a few questions. I would like you to, you said that you're going to be short on seeds this year. Do you accept people that grow heirloom seeds? Do you accept seeds back in return?
So we do not accept seeds back to the seed bank, but we do highly encourage you guys to share those with family members, community members, other citizens. I do know we don't have anything official yet. We're kind of working on some plans maybe in the future to set up a website or something where we can put citizens in contact with each other a little bit more easily. But I do know that there have been a few Facebook groups, a few social media groups who have sprung up for citizens to help share seeds with each other and kind of take some of the impact off of the seed bank, and there's been a lot of success in that. So I love to see that, and we highly encourage you guys sharing seeds.
I was just curious, what the buffalo gourd, how can you use that? Because when we were in Texas, we would see it growing wild and we'd collect it, but we didn't know what to do with it.
It's kind of the same way with the other gourds. They're utilitarian, but they are pretty small, so they can be made into rattles. They can be made into, some people actually like to make them into ornaments, but traditionally probably more like rattles or kind of small vessels, because they are pretty tiny.
I will say two of our
And buffalo gourds can be eaten, although the reason they're called buffalo gourds is because they tasted so bad not even a buffalo would eat them. But I know that during the Depression, they actually ate a lot of the root of that plant. And so it can provide sustenance. They just don't taste real great.
For corn, we have a green corn ceremony and a ripe corn ceremony. So that's how important corn is to it.
Yeah, hi. You talked about that plant your colleague ate, which he shouldn't have eaten, the one that feels like razors and all. You said it had medical application. What is that?
It wasn't so much medical applications. There are certain medicines that can be used for that, but whenever we talk about Cherokee medicines, we actually class those in 4 classes. So class 1 is like using a single plant that's usually even pretty common in Western knowledge, so something like echinacea for immune system boosting, that's class 1. Class 2 is combining those class 1 medicines, so like echinacea and elderberry for immune system building. Class 3 starts getting into combining more plants and then prayers, and class 4 are things that only medicine men would have been using and would have known the uses for, and that one tends to fall into that class 4.
Can you talk a little bit about how our river cane patches are growing? Are they thriving?
So in the garden, our river cane is definitely bouncing back, and it kind of depends. So across the Cherokee Nation Reservation, across our Cherokee tribal lands, I should say, for what we own, we have done a lot of work on mapping out, the Cherokee Nation River Cane Initiative existed for a long time, and they did a lot of work on mapping all of that river cane out, but most of what we were finding on tribal lands really wasn't big enough for harvesting, and river cane is a culturally protected species within the Cherokee Nation. And so really we're not supposed to, without permits, you're really not supposed to be harvesting it on property, but most of our stuff on our property just isn't really big enough to work with right now. The areas where there's bigger cane is all off of tribal property. Now, within our garden, we do have river cane growing, and we've had big die-offs over the years, but we do have a lot of it coming up from seed right now. We still have a lot of river cane out there, and much of it is pretty tall. It's really spreading, but we have a whole area out there that's a little bit sad looking right now because it's kind of bare, and the reason for it is if you look right down at the ground, it's all green, and that's all stuff coming up from seed. So we're hopeful our river cane is starting to rebound.
My question was going to be about the medicine keepers. Was there any sort of way to apply or to participate with them meeting or getting to know them, like for Cherokee citizens or any sort of program like that?
We don't have a specific application process or anything. They did do the educational program a couple of years ago that had actually started, I think it was a couple years before COVID, because the students were supposed to be in that program for 3 years, and it extended into 5 years. And I know that they've expressed an interest in wanting to do something similar to that again, and maybe changing the program up just a little bit. So if you just kind of keep your ear out, because eventually that will, when they go to do that program, there'll be advertisements and things on that where they might be trying to partner up with a few people to kind of help them go through that program. A lot of the meetings, they occur kind of, quarterly or something, but we've kind of had a lot of not quite as many meetings ever since COVID has happened. So we've met with a few times, but it just hasn't been quite as vibrant, I think, as it was before, and for different reasons. We've definitely lost some of our elders, unfortunately, and there's some changes kind of going on in that. And so, but there should be some opportunities in the future. I know they're really hopeful for it.
Well, Feather, we certainly appreciate, we could listen to you all day. We certainly appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and for working at the Cherokee Nation. We're really fortunate to have you. So,
Well done.
well done.
Well done.